This is the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie. That's me. And I want to ask you a question. Did you ever want to be a genius? I have my moments. I'm over that now. Today's guest has thought long and hard about the question of what it means to be a genius, and she's written an incredible book about it. She's Helen Lewis, a British journalist and podcaster who writes for The Atlantic and has a Substack under her own name. Her new book is called The Genius Myth, a curious history of a dangerous idea. It explores how the definition of what it means to be a genius has changed radically over the centuries, over the millennia, really. She also talks about how it became linked to all sorts of weird biological, racial, and nationalistic theories. And she talks about how Elon Musk has come to personify genius in our time. Part of what we talk about is whether his failure at Doge spells the end of his kind of genius moment. We also talk about the Beatles. We talk about William Shockley, who turned to racial science after winning a Nobel Prize for helping to invent the transistor. And we talk about her notorious 2018 interview with Jordan Peterson. I am not a genius, so a lot of what she said went right over my head, but I can guarantee you that this is a very rich and memorable conversation. Here is the Reason interview with Helen Lewis. Helen Lewis, thanks so much for talking to Reason.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with the obvious question. The book is The Genius Myth, a curious history of a dangerous idea, which is a great subtitle. But why did you write The Genius Myth?
Do you know what? It's one of those things where it's evolved over time. So I may be now lying to myself about why I wrote it. But I did have a conversation with a friend a couple of years ago about the idea that he has always said that genius is a right-wing concept, which I thought was a really interesting idea. Because it's about the kind of individual over the collective. It's about, sort of people with sort of sublime achievement. You are not part of the kind of common throng. And I thought that was interesting because I thought, well, I hear loads and loads of left-wing people use it very casually, and I don't think they're accepting this kind of idea behind it. And then that made me think, well, hang on a minute, what other ideas are kind of being smuggled in that little word? And that's, that's where the book kind of came from.
That's fascinating. And, it puts me in mind, the book is fantastic. I mean, it is a great read. It's better than 99% of novels I read. And I love, it's a series of stories about kind of crazy people and the people, including all of us, who enable them. But, part of the genius, or part of what you talk about in The Genius Myth is that it meant what being a genius meant radically different things in different eras. And explain in ancient Greece, and I don't know why we care about what ancient Greece thought about anything, if it gave rise to modern Greece or whatever, but the Greeks talked about having genius or being a genius meant that you were possessed with a visiting spirit. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, you have a genius. That's the original sense of it. You're visited by this spirit. And, it might be the muse of poetry speaks through you, or the muse of history. And they called it, furor poeticus, furor divinus, divine fury. And I think that captures something really well about, I don't know if you would describe yourself as a genius, Nick, but most of us wouldn't. But you must have had moments when you've sit down.
Very few people have defined me as a genius. So thank you. Most of you do not. Yeah.
But you might have had times when you sit down to write a piece or do some piece of work and it just clicks. Something just feels really good. And I think most writers probably spend most of their life kind of chasing that dragon for the rest of the time. And then you go, when will it come back? Oh, that's what writing should feel like. And most of the time it's just a kind of grind. So I think they did a very good thing then in capturing something that we've all felt to some extent.
And
there are moments that work.
You talk about how, particularly in the context of things like pop music and whatnot. And this is certainly true for writers and novelists in particular. You go on a streak where you are just performing at a higher level. I want to get into an argument about the Beatles for any number of reasons. It's independent of you. I have this argument every morning. But when you look at somebody like Paul McCartney, who you talk about in an interesting way, he's got to understand that whatever he's been doing for the past 40 years is not what he did for that, maybe 5 to 10 year period at a certain point. He was on, right? So we go from that classical understanding of genius as a visiting spirit or something where something is speaking through you, which now is almost always the province of serial killers, right, or something.
Yes, I
it's
had
like,
the dog talking to me, and it told me to kill people.
they're the last classical geniuses, I guess, in this tattered world. But then in the Renaissance, things shift. The Renaissance in the early modern period, and how does being a genius change in that period?
Maybe even a little bit later than that, because the thing about the Renaissance is obviously that word comes from renascita, rebirth. So the idea was that they were, as they saw it, bringing back the classical tradition. And it was kind of quite imitative, that you were trying to learn these kind of things about proportion and form.
Well, I don't want to get sidetracked. I'm just going to say, yes, they were smuggling what they wanted to do by saying what we're really doing is merely bringing back these eras of former greatness. Right. There's the American Renaissance in American literature, which was created in the 1940s, about the pre-Civil War period. And I believe there's a racial journal now called American Renaissance, which they want to rebirth things. But already being sidetracked. So in this early modern period redefinition of genius, what's going on?
But then you get this very, very important book that I have to say I didn't really know about, which is Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists. And it is a group biography of, I have to say, all the artists that I would have known growing up, because they were also Ninja Turtles, like Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo. But, that there is a sense that was a period of a kind of burst of creativity. And he puts them together in this kind of pantheon. And it's one of the first times that you begin to see in a really systematic way this is what I mean by the genius myth. These are stories that we tell about people who are innovators or scientists or artists. So you have, for example, the story of Leonardo da Vinci, and the myth that's imposed on him is that he couldn't settle to anything. He had a kind of, I guess, uber level of ADHD, which is that he was designing the helicopter, then he wanted to learn how to paint directly onto a wall using tempera, then he was doing something else, and he was kind of a scatterbrain.
We have all met that person in our first semester in college as well,
right?
The polymath who's so brilliant, and obviously Leonardo accomplished a few things in his life.
It's true. Not all of the people that you meet in the first semester at college go on to paint the Mona Lisa or anything like it, sadly.
And as you point out, and I'm sorry to jump in, it's just the book is so rich with insights and observations, and also introducing that, but I had never heard of that. And it's like a whole kind of retroactive series of lights went on my head in your discussion of it. But what I was getting at is that the Mona Lisa wasn't really the Mona Lisa until centuries after it
got stolen. This is one of my favorite things in all of it. Is it's the same way that Shakespeare died a respectable playwright, but he didn't die the guy that we should enthrone forever as the crowning jewel of English literature. Really a century later that began to be. And exactly the same thing with the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa was, and I'm going to be really rude here and say, quite a sludgy grey and green painting, and not seen as the crowning achievement of the Renaissance by any means. It gets stolen in the 1920s and ends up in Italy. And it becomes actually, as lots of these things do, about kind of national myths, because Leonardo was Italian or proto-Italian, but he was working for most of his life in France. So it becomes a kind of who owns this great genius, and therefore who should have the Mona Lisa. And it becomes a kind of inter-country fight.
It's also great because, in the United States in particular, Italians have always claimed Christopher Columbus, but now many of us Italian Americans are being like, oh, maybe he was working for Spain, and maybe he was a Jew. So forget, we don't need Columbus anymore. But it's Da Vinci.
You've got the Sopranos.
Da Vinci is one model of a Renaissance genius, but then talk about Michelangelo or some of the others, because the person categorizing them kind of said, okay, well, there are different gradations. He was, he seemed like very much like a boy with a bunch of Pokemon dolls or something, where he's rank ordering them and things like that.
Yeah, well, he definitely had a bias. He had a pro-Florentine bias. Mm-hmm. So he's quite rude about Titian, who was born, I think, Venice or the Alps. But, he kind of gets relegated to second status because he's not from the right place. But Michelangelo he uses as a different example, which is something you find all the time in genius myths, which is somebody who had to struggle. So that's turned into a story about how hard it was to paint the Sistine Chapel, and how he had to design all the stuff you'll hear if you go on the tour of the Sistine Chapel. He had to design
separators. Just a few months ago, and yes, right. I'm sick of it, to be quite honest.
The other thing that you will know from visiting the Sistine Chapel is that it's a lot. it's a statement, is it not?
Yeah.
It's and I think that's kind of fascinating too, is that you have to have a level of kind of ambition. The film critic called it white elephant art. These, which he didn't intend as a compliment, these films that kind of announce themselves as a masterpiece. And I think that actually is also quite plays into this. The fact that Ulysses by James Joyce is very hard to read, it's not an enjoyable novel in the conventional sense, is actually taken as being a sign of its genius. The fact that the Sistine Chapel is big, is if he'd done that much individual painting and separated out by canvases, we wouldn't find it quite so impressive as this one. Right. Oh God, what's that German word? Kunstkammerwerk. The whole thing is an artistic
I want to call
experience.
you out for pretending that you had to recall that word.
No, I did, because it's one of those compound German words
on your computer, and you use it in every conversation that you ever have.
It's true, I do actually. Yeah. You've rumbled me, but you know what I mean. Like that idea of the kind of, you still see it now when when you have like, Birdman, it's filmed like it was in a single shot, or The Revenant, it only filmed in natural light, or Tom Hanks really lost all the weight for Castaway, or Charlize Theron made herself ugly for Monster. These are kind of there's a price to greatness.
I like the movies where people gain weight, because anybody can lose weight, right? If we may jump forward a little bit, and I want to skip over him a little bit, both because he deserves to be forgotten, but I want to get to a later figure in Victorian England. But Thomas Carlyle pops up a couple times in your work, and he is kind of the modern conceptualizer, right, of great man theory, which is related to genius, but it's not quite the same thing. But you go from the Renaissance, where this new form of genius takes form.
Yeah, kind of life writing takes form. And then you get the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. Right. And what you then get is genius as a marketing tool. So if you're an artist in the 14th century, what you need is a rich aristocratic patron. If you're an artist in the 18th century, 19th century, well, actually at this point, you might be able to, there'll be things like, gallerists, start arriving, things like newspapers arrive, the mass media arrives. And so you might therefore be able to sell yourself as a kind of brand, basically.
But what's interesting is that most of the time, or at least at that point, it seems to be less the person selling themselves as a genius, and they have a Boswell, or they have somebody around them who is writing them up as like, oh, this is the real guy, like a hype man, a Flavor Flav.
Yeah, everybody needs an 18th century Flavor Flav. Yes, it's true.
But how does Thomas Carlyle, who I mean, it's fascinating because you said, and the idea of like genius as a right-wing concept, because it ultimately is exalting like a single person over the collective. That's really interesting to think about. But then you have somebody like Thomas Carlyle, who's very much of a, I don't know, in the context of his time, it's not like he was a right winger, and he hated capitalism, certainly. And he hated, all of the liberal economists who actually thought that Irish people and blacks in Jamaica were human in the same way he was. But how does he talk about great man theory, and how does that kind of add to the genius lore before it gets kind of quantified and mathematized later in that century?
Yeah, he has this line, which I'm going to mangle, but it's something like, the history of the world is at root only the history of great men.
Yeah.
And that was very in keeping with a certain type of kind of patrician Victorian thinking, that, you just needed these once in a generation personalities. And there, one of their references would have been someone like Napoleon Bonaparte, the great French general. Right. And I think there's a lot to that argument, that actually the military decisions that Napoleon made at the times that he made them changed the history of Europe. He was a consequential figure, in the same way that now, the Atlantic just ran a cover story on Donald Trump that said he's, the most consequential president of the 20th century. You don't, 21st century. You don't, I think you can I do think it's a reasonable point to say that some people are kind of hinge points in history.
I was going to make a joke about like, what's his competition so far, though? It's a zombie, a Bill, whatever. No, sorry.
And you thought, no, I love Obama, and I would never say anything mean about him.
Well, I saw, unfortunately, from my stupid libertarian point of view, I see an immense continuity between George W. Bush, Obama, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2, and it's not a good continuity. But and this is part of what you're talking about when you talk about the genius myth, is you're not saying like everybody is exactly the same and it's just a social construction that this, Leonardo gets called a great artist, but, actually anybody around him was as good. But it is this storytelling and kind of creating this sense that, these people are the limit of everything that we're doing. But
Right.
with Carlyle, I guess in a way, systematic thinking, this is what the Enlightenment was about and to some degree the Renaissance. But, it hadn't quite got there. And, certainly you get there with somebody like Marx and Engels, where they kind of say, actually it's the system, it's, the base, typically the economic base that actually determines everything else. So we might forgive Carlyle this one thing of not really.
I totally forgive him because, what's the easiest thing to do is to go, actually, it's both. Because it obviously is both, right? Some people do make decisions, but also they are products of fundamental forces that are in society.
Right. And I guess now let me, because I outed myself on my libertarian podcast show as a libertarian, I would say maybe it's people like Adam Smith who started to talk about how things don't just happen. There are a lot of kind of occult forces, invisible hands and whatnot that create order among seeming chaos. And you could extend that to individuals that we're both I feel like this is a big part of your life's work, the meta story that you tell now, which is just that it's a mix of both. It's circumstance and it's individual effort. And that should in no way ever be controversial, but it seems like it constantly needs to be relearned. That we are
it absolutely, because you bring up Carlyle and he was writing defensively. That's what I didn't really realize until I looked more at that stuff. I sort of assumed everybody in the Victorian era was swanning around going, of course the thing is that just a couple of men changed the world. But no, he was writing to defend that idea against what he saw as the kind of forces of egalitarianism, false
absolutely.
egalitarianism.
There's a fantastic book called How the Dismal Science Got Its Name by David Levy, which is a study mostly of how Carlyle and other people like him treated the Irish in popular culture and academic discourse in the basically in the long 19th century. And they were mad that, people were saying, no, actually the Irish are pretty much like the rest of us. They follow incentives. They're not all gorillas or chimpanzees or things like that.
Yeah,
and that's why he called Carlyle named the dismal science, because he said that's its main truth, is that all humans respond similarly to incentives. What a dismal science that is, that we're not somehow more elevated than the lower orders.
That's great to accidentally coin a really great phrase like that when you're trying to be read about something.
Yes.
But the point that I try and make in the book is that we always end up coming back to great man theory, no matter, even people on the left, because we want stories and stories demand protagonists.
Right.
And frankly, your biography of Napoleon is going to sell a lot better than your book about, agrarian upheaval in France in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's just more interesting to have, when you write a screenplay, the first thing anyone will ever tell you is you have to have a protagonist and they have to be active. They have to make decisions. That's how our minds want history to kind of work. But there's a brilliant paper that I reference in the book from 1922 about Are Inventions Inevitable? And the list that they have of the number of things that got invented simultaneously. The most obvious one is the telephone, right? Everybody, two people came up with the telephone and only one of them gets the credit. But, I write about Thomas Edison later in the book, and everybody had the idea for the light bulb. Every man and his dog had that idea because it's quite a simple conceptual idea. What they couldn't do for 100 years was manufacture it and reliably make it work. And the real genius of Edison, if he had it, was, I think, the New York City power grid. But again, that's just not as compelling a story as man invents light bulb that you can see and hold in your hand.
And Edison then, and you point out that he, ended up in a fight that he lost. I mean, he lost a lot of his invention battles overall in terms of he was a proponent of direct current, and alternating current won out and ultimately kind of swallowed a lot of his activity. And with Edison, I mean, there's always the fascinating concept of, Edison versus Tesla. So you have Edison is one kind of genius, and then Tesla is another crazy, more romantic genius because he ended in failure. Do you know my favorite
anecdote is the fact that Tesla walked out of Edison's lab where he worked for a while because they had a bet, which Tesla won. And then Edison got really grumpy about him.
Yeah.
And I just think this is fascinating because I don't know if you know, a couple of months ago, the podcaster Sam Harris told the story about he had a bet about deaths in the coronavirus with Elon Musk. And Sam Harris won. And then he said, so where's my, so pay up, son. And then Elon Musk kind of just kind of grumpy and ended their friendship. And
I like that. That is a great way for Sam Harris to call himself a genius.
To call himself Tesla.
Right? Yeah.
But it is also interesting that, in the book, I had already made this comparison between Edison and Elon Musk, both in the sense of the style of invention that they do, their talent for publicity, but also this kind of the ego, frankly, that has made them want to play the public role of an inventor. And I think that's where the bet story really comes from. Neither of them like to be beaten or humiliated. They were both schemers. They're not ivory tower scientists just happy to do their own thing and let the chips fall where they may. They both want to be out there in the world selling themselves. And so that echo was very pleasing.
Yeah, no, and we'll talk more about Musk at the end, I think, or towards the end of this conversation. But, Edison also was, I guess he really did work long hours, but he was also... He did what Benjamin Franklin called visible industry. Like he made sure, how did you know Edison worked 24 hours a day? It's because he told you every time he saw you. Or he had people in the press who were either sycophants or on his payroll or whatever, who were telling people like this, I guess it's not clear that he ever said that creativity or genius is 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration, but that captured the image that he was pushing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've got actually, I think, more respect for Edison as a businessman and as a marketer than I had when I came in. But you're right. Because everyone wanted the myth to be that, they were kind of, the easiest mark is somebody who wants to believe what you're selling them.
Right.
And everybody wanted to believe that he was this, the American Prometheus, he was stealing fire from the gods. And this is what I mean to come back to nationalism again. This was a time in which America was the future. America was, Europe was kind of classy, but it was old and hidebound and dying. And America was the new continent of steel and electricity and the railroad and these big barons. And Edison fitted that image that America had of itself at that time. So he slotted himself very neatly. There was a pre-made genius myth for him as an American genius.
Right. And I mean, he, if I'm remembering, there was a fantastic series of kids' books called Childhood of Famous Americans.
Oh, right.
And it was the same story told over and over again, but they would change the names and places. And there was one of Edison, and part of his myth is that at some point he was working as, a baggage boy on a railroad or something, and he was missing his train, and he gets pulled in by his ears, which caused hearing loss. So he was... he became a great telegraph operator, and his kids were nicknamed Dot and Dash. But a lot of it came from, he was a small kid from nowhere who had bad hearing because of this industrial accident. And then he becomes, the greatest inventor of all time.
He gets rewritten as well as Tom Edison, Tom Edison,
right.
like Tom Sawyer, rather than his actual first name, which was Alva. And that just speaks to the kind of, it's not, no one's working class hero.
The country hasn't been invented yet that's going to promote an Alva as their great inventor. And there's a famous movie called Young Tom Edison with like Jimmy Stewart or somebody playing him. So this movie gets done again and again. But now let's bring it back to the evil effects of the British on public discourse, and let's talk about Francis Galton, because what is interesting, I mean, so you have the geniuses themselves who become public either because somebody writes about them or they're creating their own myth. But then you have somebody like Francis Galton who helped kind of quantify or tried to quantify what genius meant, and also why it's hereditary and why it persists in certain types of people but not others. Explain who Francis Galton is.
He was a really brilliant dilettante from the time when you could just skip around and come up with lots of different things. So, he tried to create a beauty map of the British Isles and work out where the women were hottest. I mean, very much actually the precursor of Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook in that respect. Yeah. So, yeah.
But he was he a lifelong bachelor, or he definitely was childless, right?
He married, yes, but I can't detect any real enthusiasm for women or indeed any other people at all.
Did he marry? Did he fight? Like he was like the Orkney Islands have the hottest babe, so I'm going there or something.
No, I think it was an arranged marriage. There's a bit in his memoir of his essentially like gap year where he goes to Africa. And one of the chieftain offers him a woman as a, quote, temporary wife, and he declines because she's covered in ochre, that orange pigment, and he doesn't want to get it on his white linen suit. And it's just the sort of most like Englishman abroad kind of colonial parody you've ever heard.
That is pretty amazing. Yeah, you have a lot to be ashamed of as a
Okay, thank you. I'll take that one on the chin.
Yeah.
He was also, though, the half cousin of Charles Darwin. He came from this, very storied family in the 19th century, and he therefore was familiar with the idea of evolution by natural selection. This was the idea that the survival of the fittest, that people pass down something that now we'd think of it in terms of genes. They didn't have that kind of biological basis to it initially. But he was very interested to think, well, hang on a minute, you can breed dogs in all of these different ways. You can breed cattle. Maybe we could breed humans. And this is what I mean about him not showing really any kind of
sense, right?
Right, but him not showing any kind of fellow feeling for other humans. Yeah. It was like, and where could this possibly go wrong? I'm sure this won't have any bad consequences whatsoever. Yeah. And of course it did, right? Because he coined the term eugenics, which is from good birth, essentially, and therefore dysgenics, which you hear a bit about today. Yeah. And he wrote this book called Hereditary Genius, in which he sort of tried to work out how frequently genius and high achievement occurred in the population and how it was passed down. And people were kind of slagging it off from the very beginning. There's a great dunk of it from a Victorian writer at the time, because he works out that there's a whole family of judges, and he says essentially he posits the kind of existence of a kind of hereditary judginess. And someone else calls them a snug little galaxy of jobbers, which I think is right. They're just the idea that actually, if you're a judge and your nephew wants to be a judge, then there may be other ways by which that happens rather than pure genetic inheritance. So, but that's a very influential book among a whole generation of statisticians, because he was a brilliant statistician, and they were also heavily influenced by eugenics.
Can I ask, was he actually a brilliant statistician, or was he just really novel in what he applied statistics to? Like, he measured a lot of stuff and then said, okay, well, it means this. But, I mean, and I guess the question
when
is,
they didn't really have concepts like, standard deviation, correlation, things like that. They come from his thinking and his work. So he's there right at the birth of this discipline as an academic one. So I think you can say that he was brilliant.
Okay. And does he... I mean, I guess to go back to the idea of do individuals create inventions, or do these larger forces kind of produce them? Is he, as England is moving out of, or, as the modern world, certainly Europe is moving out of, kind of inherited aristocracy, he kind of provides a rationale for why the ruling class deserves to be there. This is more of a Marxist kind of interpretation, but it's that Victorian England had to produce Francis Galton, because otherwise people would be like, why am I listening to these people simply because they, when I was born, they had more money than me?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And also he provides an excellent justification for imperialism, which was also great enthusiasm of England at the end of the 19th century.
But it's not like he didn't create it, but he kind of provides a justification for what's happening anyway, which in a lot of social theory, that probably, well, now that I'm thinking about it, that might be more a better interpretation of a lot of social theory, that it's not leading where society goes, but it's rather kind of explaining why we're doing what we're already doing.
Yeah, I think you can say there was a kind of Francis Galton shaped hole in the discourse, and he popped into it quite neatly to say Europeans are of better racial stock than Africans, right? And that was obviously something that white Europeans were very keen to hear at the end of the 19th century.
Well, some of them, right? Because it really took a couple more generations to figure out, okay, well, which, who are the Europeans who are actually European, as opposed to kind of, Africa du Nord. I mean, by the end of the 19th century, you had people who were like, well, the Alpines, the Nordics and the Alpines are okay, but these Mediterraneans, they're not really here.
Well, that's where we have to flick it over to the Americans really taking up the mantle on that, because they just went, hang on a minute, well, Polish people aren't quite European, Italian people aren't quite European, Irish people aren't quite European. We mean the Nordics, right? And that's our racial laws are going to say that there's, That's the true descendants of the ancient Greeks, bizarrely. I don't know why the ancient Greeks got away scot-free despite being from Southern Europe as being very intelligent.
If they were so good, they wouldn't have gone away. I mean, this is what I don't understand. But
yeah. So yeah, you're right. So he just becomes a very influential figure in what then develops into eugenics and race science. So his name has recently been taken off a lot of buildings at University College London. And it's one of those ones where I think I'm okay with it. You know, I think there are lots of cases for where that tendency went too far.
And
but
am I remembering correctly? Part of his research method was measuring like the column inches or the number of mentions in encyclopedias of famous people. He did
obituaries, and then Havelock Ellis, who was a sexologist, does another book in which he basically gets out a ruler, and then. But this is the problem: that always what happens with these people is they get completely stuffed by Shakespeare, about whom we know very little, and Jane Austen, who has lived a very quiet, boring, blameless life in a parsonage, and so the biographical idea that that you have a lot of biographical details and you get written about a lot completely falters, and then they just end up fudging these lists, these supposedly scientific lists of genius.
The methodology that Charles Murray used in his book Human Accomplishment, where he looked at reference works and measured column inches, which I think
I don't recommend
probably calls more for a Freudian interpretation rather than a mathematical interpretation of what's going on. But
I think you can say it's all interesting data, but it's not objective scientific data, because it's about how you can measure how someone's reputation has changed over time, but you can't say there's a kind of version of just desserts where the most intelligent people get the most column inches. I think our own media at the moment would heavily debunk that idea.
Talk about eugenics briefly, because we're also, and this is in the Musko sphere and Peter Thiel's sphere and stuff like that, where people are talking about eugenics. It's one thing, if you're saying the state is running, things and saying you can mate with these people, but not these people and things like that. But, when you are going to Burning Man or you're at the Bohemian Grove and it's a voluntary association, we all are eugenicists. We all practice some form of good birth, where we choose these people rather than those people. Is there a way to disentangle eugenics from its kind of history? Is there a eugenics which does not immediately, or quickly devolve into kind of racial sorting and some kind of, horrific, cataclysm of human suffering?
In practice, I think no. I think in theory, you're right. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to go in those directions. And I think actually, again, I think you're kind of alluding to this. Most people, when you drill down to it, are softly eugenicists themselves. Most people, they choose their partner because they think their partner's attractive and smart and would be a good father or mother, which is itself kind of eugenicist. The second thing is that most people are broadly supportive of women having abortions of babies with severe and life-limiting illnesses, even those like Down syndrome that aren't necessarily fatal. So, lots of people think that looking after a disabled kid would be really hard and people should have the choice to opt out of that. So, I have this argument with one of my friends who has written brilliant books about eugenics. And I said, but that is eugenics. And you just don't want to call it eugenics because to you, eugenics is bad. But you support this. And I think that's that's what I mean about in practice. I think that there are things that people do agree with that you could describe as eugenic. But in any kind of organized movement, it is so unbelievably tainted by what happened in California in the 30s, huge amounts of sterilizations of the quote unquote feeble-minded, by what happened under the Nazis, that no reputable scientist would touch it with a 10-foot barge pole. And I don't really see the need to rehabilitate it, right? In these individual cases, I think people have made their own agreement.
I realize it's a little bit off topic, but we are now, because there is a demographic collapse happening, because women, it's women's fault. Women are having fewer children now that they, have more job opportunities.
Right, because they're grasshoppers and they reproduce by themselves. Yeah, it's women's fault. Yeah.
But there is, throughout the West, certainly in the U.S., but then especially in those old parts of Europe that maybe really aren't European, places like Hungary, there's a big push for natalism. The state needs to pump up the volume of kids being born, and countries like Singapore spend a billion or millions of dollars a year trying to do that. Is that is that a form of eugenics as well, or should we be concerned from a kind of history of eugenics point of view of what happens when the state starts to say, you need to be having more kids?
I think the main contradiction to that is that we don't have any evidence that it works.
No.
Stalin had a medal that was like, if you had 10 kids, you kind of got a medal.
I think it was 6 or something. But
it was to me what I consider to be a lot of children. And there have been regimes through history that have tried to do that.
Right.
Currently, Viktor Orban in Hungary said very explicitly, I don't want more immigrants, I want more Hungarians. Mm-hmm. And he has put tax breaks for people who have more than 3 children, reductions on like a people carrier. But with negligible effects from what I can see, unless you're running a really brutally directive society like China, where you can dictate to people how many kids they're allowed to have. In other places,
it was more having fewer kids.
But now, of course, like, please, can you actually people start having children again? We've realised that this is a demographic problem, and I think that will be harder to reverse than the previous one-child policy. But that's the thing that's interesting. And I think actually I've forgotten her name, the brilliant researcher Alice, and I've just talked to Ross Dutat about this at the New York Times, that actually it's not even just the West, it's actually quite conservative societies in North Africa are also seeing this reduction in birth rates.
No, it tracks perfectly with, the proxy that I've seen brooded about a lot, is that the number of years of education women have on average, as that increases, fertility rates decline always and everywhere. And it's that the world has become more modern, meaning that women have more opportunity and more equality and more education. And, I know Mexican women in Mexico have more kids than they do in America. And they cross the border and they have fewer kids. And that's not even that big a difference, but everywhere. Yeah, it's a global phenomenon.
But also,
I think it should be seen as a sign of progress, actually, because it means more people, I think, are making more choices. But
I think it's a sign of progress. I think it is very hard to square with our current gerontocracies in terms of our political systems. I mean, that's the problem. In Britain, having fewer working age people to support more older people is a problem when those older people are on unsustainably high pensions and early retirement.
I have a political ideology of limited government and a basic social safety welfare net that I would love to sell to you right now. The problem isn't that people are getting older; it's that we have unsustainable entitlement programs that we can thank Bismarck for.
Okay. Okay. So so far, the villains of today's podcast are the English and Otto von Bismarck. Right. Okay, good to have the enemies list updated.
Yes.
Right. Let's come on. Surely let's argue about the Beatles now, Nick. You've been holding out on me.
Before we get to them, I want to talk about William Shockley, who is somebody that I think a fair number of my audience will remember. And he encapsulates something perfect, partly because he is related. He's a kind of semi-direct descendant intellectually of Galton, but he is also fantastic because he brings us closer to Silicon Valley. William Shockley won a Nobel Prize for his role, contested as it may be, in developing the transistor. And then he became he took that.
A massive prick, and everybody left his firm, and they went on to found Silicon Valley. Is the short way?
That's right. So he on the business end, he had this great creation, or was part of a great invention, and then he was such a terrible manager that everybody who worked for him, who were incredibly talented, were like, "Fuck it, we're going and starting our own company," and that became modern Silicon Valley. And then he spent the rest of his life. Electronics, who cares? I want to talk about racial differences that are quantifiable. And he is the genius, in a way, he's the genius who precedes many other figures that we'll talk about, but where he was great at one thing, but then he spent most of his time talking about stuff that is just crazy pants and takes away from his luster as a great inventor.
Yeah, I was just rereading the interview that he did with Playboy. It was one of those kind of great heyday of Playboy, 9 billion page interviews.
Yeah.
And it's really sad to see somebody who obviously had a great scientific brain, but they've just picked up a load of goo, basically. Like, for example, he didn't, the interviewer talks to him about his decision to donate to the so-called Genius Sperm Bank, which is a kind of cursed idea from the start. But he has no idea that men's sperm degrades with age, and that at 70, the old swimmers might not be in the best condition that they were, and he just completely hasn't looked into that. And it's a kind of sad version of someone who obviously had a great and flexible intellect in their youth, and they've just kind of hardened. And I don't know about you, but when I was reading that, it felt like one of those kind of internet social media era midlife crises, kind of ahead of its time. Like, I'm sure the obvious example is Naomi Klein's book about Naomi Wolf, the kind of great feminist scholar, gets caught out and then drifts into the kind of QAnon sphere, and now thinks that 5G
Wolf got found out on, was it the BBC?
Live on radio. She basically had a book that was about gay men, and she said that there were a number of them who were executed for sodomy, and it turned out that the phrase that had been written was death recorded, and that didn't mean they'd been executed. That meant that they'd had a death sentence. And actually, most of them had ended up, I think, commuted or whatever. But it was just this very embarrassing thing that dented her credibility in the liberal sphere. So she went over to the other side.
And here is, I'm going to make, this is an act of genius that I almost certainly won't pull off because I'm not a genius. But that moment where she is live talking to the interviewer who points that out to her, and she's like, oh, well, like, I mean, you just see something change. It's almost like having a stroke. It's very similar to the moment, and I believe you mentioned this in the book, the Peter Jackson documentary about the Beatles, Get Back, when the song Get Back comes into recognizable form, where these, the Fab Four are noodling around, and then suddenly you hear this classic song come into being.
It's but it's a live action shot of somebody who basically, and I think that's exactly what happened to Shockley. Shockley won his Nobel Prize. The career stalled. He couldn't understand what had happened to it. He made, I think, one idle comment about IQ, and everyone screamed at him. And he did exactly what happens to lots of people now in that situation, where he felt like that was unfair and unjust. And so he kind of did it harder. Wow. And he became a provocateur, and he got into this mindset of like, the more that I'm owning the libs, the writer I must be. And I think you just, you see that. I still think you still see that now. And I understand it psychologically.
Yeah. Like you say, I'm this thing that, that is horrible. And it's like, I'm going to be your worst nightmare version of that. Yeah. And you in the point about Shockley, and this, this is, a credit to the book and to your work, is that Shockley was not, there was an ongoing study of IQ and like super smart kids in California that he did not make the cut for.
Yeah.
Right. Know. So that you have a guy who becomes obsessed with IQ as this thing that is free floating and independent from all sorts of influences. And you have to, anybody reading that in the contemporary world would say, oh, he became obsessed with IQ because he was a genius, but he was not ratified as a genius in this, grammar school or high school study going on in California.
I found that very telling. Yeah, that's Lewis Terman's genetic studies of the gifted. And the cutoff point was either 140 or 135 on this particular IQ score. And he claims that his mother got an IQ score of 150, but he was below it. And actually, there was one other Nobel Prize winner, Louis Alvarez, who also didn't make the cut. And the really sad thing is, in that Playboy interview, he says, well, I think probably my IQ's gone up a bit since then, which isn't really how it works between being a school kid and being 70, right? But obviously you can, I think you're exactly right. When I read that, I thought, oh, there's the chip on the shoulder. Right. That actually he's had all the success. What more success could you want than having a Nobel Prize if you're in the sciences? But somehow there's some little bit of him that still feels that he's not enough. And actually, if he clings to this idea of superiority through IQ and racial superiority through IQ, that kind of that rubs a little bit of salve on that chip.
What goes into people who and I want to get to the Beatles because I can talk about the Beatles endlessly. I met Paul McCartney once, which as a college kid, so it was quite exciting, and it led to one of the reasons that I no longer like the Beatles so much. But okay. So that's a good tease, right? But to focus on Shockley a little bit, what goes on where you are a genius in this field or these sets of fields, having something to do with manufacturing or science or invention and electricity. And then you say like, well, fuck it. What I really want to talk about is race and IQ. is it, I mean, you mentioned like his career seemed to stall because literally nobody wanted to work with it. They were like, I'm leaving, you cannot lock me in this factory anymore. Like, I'm just going. But, how does that happen? Because this is kind of, part of what the book is about is that we're in a golden age now where it's like, if you are really good at making money on Wall Street, or if you are really good at inventing an electric car, if you are really good at, making pop music, we really want to hear your thoughts about all of these other fields that absolutely nothing fucking about.
Yeah. I know, it's strange, isn't it? I think, yeah, that does seem to me the Shockley story. There is a heavy suggestion that he kind of piggybacked on the precise version of the transistor that won the Nobel Prize. It was really
Right.
other people's work. And that people in the lab got tired of him being a kind of credit hog. And then he started getting into applying psychometric testing to his employees, which is always always a red flag, I would say.
If I may, I've never had to take a psychometric job, or that presented itself as such for a job. But my father worked for a shipping company, and he used to tell this story that I found very funny. It was called Sealand, and it kind of popularized containerized shipping in the post-war era. But it was founded by a guy named Malcolm McLean, who was an illiterate kind of son of sharecroppers in North Carolina. And then at a certain point, when the company got big enough, they were like, okay, you got to start taking business seriously. And they had all of the employees take kind of basic IQ tests to see if they were Sealand, worthy people. And Malcolm McLean failed it because he was basically illiterate and he was not functioning at the higher level. But, so you had this moment at the birth of, or maybe not the birth, but in the heyday of scientific management, where a guy who revolutionized the shipping would not be hired at his own company because he was kind of retarded.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah,
I mean,
so
it doesn't surprise me because I think that there are lots of you would always want to have a higher IQ than not, but I think people overrate that. When you're getting way above the average, how important it is versus personality traits like conscientiousness, like openness to experience, whatever it might be. So I think that I'm entirely unsurprised by that. But your question kind of speaks to one of the things I talk about in the book, which is this idea of galaxy brainedness, which is the idea that I'm a smart person. All my opinions are smart.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think it's just demonstrably not true. And the other thing is, I think it's really sad for the geniuses themselves, because you look at someone like Shockley, and he has his success because his type of intelligence and his breakthroughs interact with a particularly fertile moment in the history of Silicon Valley, right? He had the right brain for the right time.
Right.
And what often happens to people is that lasts for a while and then it goes away. And that is a really traumatic process for them, particularly if they've become kind of high on their own supply and they believe that they're a superior sort of person. Why I'm pressing the gas pedal and nothing, the car's not moving forward anymore, and they can't understand it. And that does often, I think, lead people to turn to kind of bitterness and resentment rather than a kind of appreciation of, like, most people don't get one hot streak. Maybe I won't get two, but the one I had was pretty good.
So this is a good segue to talk about the Beatles and kind of music or creativity streaks where you're hot and then suddenly you're not. And I guess part of we have been I don't know I'm assuming broad social trends in Britain are similar to America, but certainly over the past 30 or 40 years we have been pushing galaxy brain ideas on school children and things like that. The idea that you have a domain-specific genius or intelligence doesn't seem to be in favor. We talk about general intelligence, and it's kind of like if you're good at one thing, you're going to be good at everything. So, I mean, we're kind of reaping that, that whirlwind. I'm not even sure I'm using that term properly, but because people like Elon Musk are told when they're a kid, well, you are really smart. You do great on standardized tests. So everything you say, you get an A in every subject. So, like, why wouldn't you start talking about, fertility or something like that? So let's talk about the Beatles a bit. How did the Beatles? I mean, it's fascinating. Shakespeare and the Beatles are like the two great British exports, right?
Yeah.
And I really appreciate your focus on kind of the way that all of this stuff kind of plays into national myth making and things like that. Because when you talk to French or German people, they're like, yeah, Shakespeare's pretty good, but he's not great. English speaking people and Americans, I think, probably love Shakespeare more than English people, because we have spent, a couple hundred years trying to be like, no, Melville, he's as good. And Walt Whitman's, during graduate school, I studied American literature, and it was fascinating. Right around the time that the Berlin Wall came down and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly Americanists who had been spending 50 years searching for the American Shakespeare, we're finally like, hey, you know what? Like, we don't actually have to work. Britain is now a minor literature because America is, our literature matters because we're the world power, dominant. We don't have anything to apologize for on some level. But roundabout way of getting to the Beatles, like you particularly talk about how within the Beatles mythology, John is seen as the kind of genius, and Paul is, he's the jobber, right? He's just like a hard worker. What goes into that? And why do you pick Paul over John?
Well, I for a start, I say this slightly incendiary line, which is, I think, in terms of their long-term reputation, we're very lucky that it's Paul who's made it to 80 and John is now a hallowed memory, because I think if John was still around, he'd be an extremely grumpy reactionary, probably doing quite bad tweets. Whereas
that would be glorious, though. So
would it? Whereas Paul McCartney has grown into that kind of father of the nation role, and like the younger musicians go and play pilgrimage to him, all that.
Oh, and it's interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but like I know George Harrison, who's also important in this kind of Holy Trinity. And, you realize as age goes on that Ringo is the only Beatle really worth caring about in the long run. But George...
Ringo is lovely in Get Back, right? One of my friends described him as being like this sort of lovely Labrador, and he's like a sort of emotional support animal that because he's there just exuding kind of Ringo energy, he calms everything down, because people don't want to have a row in front of Ringo and they don't want to upset Ringo. And actually that is an underrated skill in kind of a high, crucible of tempestuous creative passion.
But George, towards the end of his life, and towards the end of the 90s, like he couldn't, he was grumpy, and he, when Oasis openly paid, a compliment to him, by talking about Wonderwall, which is a reference to, his first or near first solo album, he was like, Oasis sucks. Like he hated everybody younger than him. He was grouchy and grumpy.
Oasis's reputation has not stood the test of time, has it?
No, I don't think so. They were
selling out a lot of concerts. Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting one to see when people are
and they
reminded
have
of the
their
actual
own
music.
That's a variation, right, on the genius theme of the the brother who writes everything is really the genius. I mean, they're doing like the version of the Kinks with Ray Davies and Dave Davies,
right? And two people who hate each other because they both got something the other hasn't, right? One's the kind of Liam hates Noel for being able to write songs, and Noel hates Liam for being the charismatic frontman. Anyway, but there's a sort of similar version of that with John and Paul, where John is cast in the role of being kind of the rock bad boy. And that's what people kind of want at the time from their singers. Whereas Paul is seen as kind of domestic and managerial and a bit of a boring admin guy. And, his songs focus on kind of mundane stuff. Whereas, John is writing much more surreal and whimsical stuff, and that's much more creative. So I think, you see by the end of the breakup that they've been put into those two categories, and that John has got the much more flattering one,
right?
But I don't think it would necessarily
from a kind of romantic demonic, like the romantics loving Satan. I mean, John is that kind of rock creative genius.
Yeah, exactly. Untamable, weird, odd. Him and Yoko were kind of wandering around filming their bottoms and all that kind of stuff. He's performing a much more obvious genius role, whereas Paul McCartney's gone to live on a Scottish island and send his kids to a public school, and just been wanting to be quote unquote normal, right? Trying to live as a normal a life as a rock star could live, and therefore, one of the things. I was just talking to a playwright last week about the book, and I said, the thing is, people would rate you as more talented if you were just weirder. You're too normal. Yeah. You should try and cultivate an aura of eccentricity, because people would misread it as brilliance.
Yeah. I want to get to two other points before we stop talking, and I guess the first is, it's called the genius myth, and it really, part of it, and I can hear people being like, "Oh, you're just putting down anybody who accomplishes things. You are cutting down the tall poppy or whatever." There's a great. The Canadian band Rush has a great song called "The Trees," which is about how all the maple trees are trying to keep this oak from growing taller than them. And they were in an Ayn Rand phase when they produced that. And I'm like, maple leaf, that must be the regular Canadian, and they just don't want Rush to become too big. But it's about the myth. And how did you become interested in kind of not the things that people do that are interesting, but then like the way that it ends up being talked about?
I think people in groups are kind of completely fascinating, because I don't know about you, but I find it hard enough to understand individual people and the fact that they think in completely different ways to me, and just things that to me are completely obvious they just disagree with me on. And it's the kind of life's project just to be like, but other people's brains are different. But then you add in the complexity of them being in crowds, and it becomes completely impossible to understand why people do the things that they do. And so lots and lots of my writing about political movements, about social change, focuses on exactly those kind of weird emergent properties of people in groups. And that's what interested me about this, is that, you don't get to declare yourself a genius. You can try, right? Lots of people have, and quite a lot of them have been cruelly rebuffed. But, genius is created by a crowd looking at you and adoring you and hailing you. And therefore, the kind of interesting question is not just to talk about the properties of the people who are being adored, but the properties of the crowd. Right. And so I'm always really interested in celebrity,
Yeah, you talk about, Elon Musk in the beginning of the book is an argument of, what society values, but also what we're willing to tolerate, because it's this whole package. Like, how did we get to a point where we're willing to say, and this is an older example, but it's like, well, Roman Polanski deserves to fuck any child that he wants because he made Chinatown. Right.
I mean, generally, that is the way that people used to talk about it. They used to say that it was
Bernard Henri Lévy, the great human rights advocate, said that when he was when Polanski was arrested in Switzerland and was going to be deported to the U.S. So it's
or like it's not rape, or all of these kind of weaselly things, or that it was Philistines. That's what one French actress said. Philistines, and in this campaign of smearing against him. And you're like, I'm going to take this wild position that I don't think it's good to drug and sexually assault teenagers. Well, just call me a prude if you will.
To confess to that, he pled guilty, and then he fled because he was worried that the plea bargain that was in place might not come through on the terms that he wanted. To talk about the kind of people who help create the myth, you have a great chapter, and I'm misreading the title because I don't have it, or misrecalling it, but it's about the widow of the genius. And you talk about people like Orwell's wife. Yeah. But I'm especially interested in talking about Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, who was an artist, plausibly, of equal talent, potentially, but she kind of consciously ultimately played a role of saying, like, okay, I'm going to take a break and I'm going to kind of build up his myth. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also, one of the things that I find fascinating, this is about your work in general, but it's particularly strong in this book, of the gender dimension to all of this, because geniuses, when you think of a genius, you think of boy genius, you don't think of girl genius.
The Romantics were quite explicit about this. They thought genius was a male property, but it was a man who had a kind of feminine spirit within him. Right. This was the idea of a poet.
But they're not girls.
No. It was fey sort of feminine men, but never butch ladies. No, right. That was not the same at all. So those roots of the gendering of genius are really, really deep. And I think there's pretty good research that says we're more likely to describe boys as brilliant. Like, that is just an adjective that we apply more readily to men than women.
But is that something relatively recent? And and then it becomes hard because in terms of if we're talking about harder core patriarchal structures, this is I had a conversation with Richard Dawkins once where he was talking about various things, and I was just like, it's really weird to me that, like, girls, like, you look back in human history, and girls just couldn't pole vault until about 1985.
Very
And
that's a bit of
is that because of
feminism today.
biology? Yeah, is that because of biology? And it was like I grew up in a world in high school where girls were not allowed to participate in the pole vault because they couldn't do it. Evolution did not allow them to have the upper body strength to pole vault. And how many times you recognize things that are treated as facts of nature are obviously social constructions and change. And I'm not denying differences between men and women,
Oh,
that are
sure. No, I'm
rooted
sure
in
women are worse
evolution.
at pole
But
vaulting, right? I'm sure that
yeah,
now,
they
if
they
you
do
like,
not
upper
do
body
as well.
strength
Yeah.
is definitely sexually
But what I'm
dimorphic.
getting at is the question of girl and boy geniuses, because we now live in an age where, the equality of sex is certainly under the law, and even in places where testing is used, girls do better in high school. Girls get into college more often. They graduate college more
Yeah.
often. Are we going to look forward to a future of girl geniuses that are as insufferable as boy geniuses?
Well, that's the final dream of feminism, isn't it?
Yeah,
To be as
I think
insufferable
so.
as
Yeah.
men. Yeah, I don't know, because I think that
I think they might have unlocked that goal, or at least
yeah,
some
I
of
think
some
they're
of
right.
them
Yeah, I
have.
think
Yeah.
some of us are trying. But I think that's a really interesting question, because I think there are undoubtedly women who have really high achievement in ways that they were
Yeah.
blocked out of. There's still an open question about whether or not there are sex differences in the kind of selfishness and ambition that is required to be like a William Shockley. Actually, are these traits that we really want to encourage in our children the kind of things that make you the Nobel winning scientist? Or actually, that's also an interesting question about the fact that science has changed so much. There's very
Mhm.
little low hanging fruit that one person can now do. Most great science projects now are deeply collaborative, often across countries. But it's also about whether or not who the crowd wants to hold up as the genius. And I still think that both men and women are more reluctant to idolize women. So
Mhm.
I don't think it necessarily will level out, actually, because again, it's not an objective awarding of a quality that is awarded on merit. It's about why are you celebrating someone, because what does it say about you, or what does it say about the qualities that you want to stress? So, I think we definitely do have more women who are celebrating their way. And also the other thing I would say, about to go back to Lee Krasner, my editor made a very good note in that chapter, which I incorporated, which is that she has been the benefit of a explicitly feminist genius myth, which is that feminist historians love the idea of finding overlooked women and lifting them up and celebrating them. And you see that with Artemisia Gentileschi, the Renaissance painter. You see it with Lee Krasner. And so there are a new set of genius myths, which are sometimes in themselves quite reductive, which is the poor downtrodden woman who
Right.
never got her flowers during her life. And like now we're here as the kind of historical court of appeal to kind of make that right. So yeah, there will be some women who'll benefit from that, but I would doubt that it would level out at any time soon.
Do you, what kind of pushback do you face when you bring up, kind of the social context of the creation of things like genius? And then also, obviously, and I don't know, was this part of what your book is, that there's a line or a chapter, like there really is no light bulb moment, that
Yeah.
Edison, tried a million different things, and all of these people, et cetera. But, for you certainly burst into a bigger view when, was it 2018, when you had that great interview with Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, what I like to do is confuse people by getting attacked from a completely different political tendency every
Yeah.
couple of years and just switching it up. So, there are people who've spent the last couple of years thinking that I'm this, anti-woke conservative. And then I'm now going to go through a phase. I think you're right. The people who don't read the book will think that this is some misguided egalitarian feminist nonsense that says, everybody can be Monet, everybody can be Einstein, everybody can be
Right.
Picasso, whatever it might be. So yeah, I think that there will be misreadings like that. But I don't, you can only write the book. You can't force people to read it, tragically. So
No.
it's,
Well,
and I think it
it's
is.
a better world where authors cannot force people to
Yeah,
read.
right. I was going to say, I think
But
maybe Mao got
with
people to read his book, but yeah.
the well, he could get you to hold it up, right? But and I guess Gaddafi did that too, right? He had his little green book that's all over. I'm sure it's still in the basements of the U.S. embassy in Benghazi or whatever. But with that Jordan Peterson interview, what is amazing, like when it came out, I watched and I was like, okay, this is really, it's just great journalism. On your credit, like, what was funny to me, and like it's even more clear on a second viewing, is just that like you're asking basic questions and like his, he is a male genius and he is, he uses ratiocination. He is incredibly learned, but it's like he's about to cry half the time. Like he is so emotional. Do you think we've entered into a period where men, the kind of male recourse to anger is now being recognized less as, genius and more as a failure to cope with what's going on in the circumstance?
I hope that's true, because I know what you mean. Like, particularly the kind of plethora of those, very cruel videos of people having public meltdowns.
Mhm.
I think you often see men melting down in public in a way that suggests that they've just never learned to process and manage, feelings of humiliation or
Right.
denial, and in a way that's quite unhealthy. And I think everybody would probably benefit from from working a bit harder on that. But I'm pleased that you picked that up, because I do think it was a very funny, because that was explicitly set up, that interview with Peterson, as a feminist.
This was like, if I may make an analogy, this is
Yeah.
like when Playboy sent a black interviewer to
Yeah.
go to William Shockley,
it was.
sending a woman to interview Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, for their Men of the Year issue. And that's
Yeah.
the thing that's very funny, is that because everybody wanted it to be me to be this kind of like, emotional little lady, and him to be the great man of science, kind of loftily delivering these insights. But as you say, I'm there being quite sarcastic because that's how I roll. And he's the one who's kind of tearing up. It was actually very gender non-conforming in that respect. So credit to everyone involved there.
And he fits into this category of like, he obviously toiled in the, the groves of academia, or, in the academy for a long time, and had developed a certain kind of expertise and a certain level of reputation. And then when he broke big, now he, is giving people tips on how to tie their tie and things like that. Right.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone who knew him actually in Toronto earlier this week, and they said, he was a really great, like the research was really good, and the teaching was really good, and his students really liked him, and everybody who knows him from that period in his life is like, oh, you were a really great psychology professor, but you are probably not psychologically suited to be an internet commentator. Some people just have got hides of inch thick leather, and that but stuff bounces off them. But clearly he's somebody who really takes criticism to heart, and it affects him quite deeply, and he's really not kind of cut out for brawling with people on the internet. So,
can I ask before, and I promise that we're going to go to Musk, and then I'll let you get on with your day or tea or whatever you people are doing in England now, curtsying to the
crumpets,
Queen as she drives by. In your previous book, Difficult Women, which is excellent. I mean, I am a big fan of kind of second wave feminism, which now gets read out of context, where you read women, like Valerie Solanas, the woman who shot Andy Warhol or whatever, and, they're read out of context. And obviously she shouldn't have shot Andy Warhol. That was like, if she should have shot Norman Mailer, if she understood her own theory and things like that. And that would have been great. But no, but what I'm saying, second wave feminism, like from the late 60s and early 70s, also often gets read in a void. So it just seems like these shrieking harpies who are talking about castrating men, et cetera. And it's like always taken out of context that like, yeah, they were denied entry into universities or into jobs, et cetera, like that. But one of the figures that you've talked about a fair amount is Germaine Greer. Who
talking about Norman Mailer, I mean, if you ever watched the live debate, she just walks in, she throws her foxfur stole over her shoulder and starts talking about kind of building cathedrals in this uber academic way. I mean, I love it.
No, I mean, you could power all the energy needs of the developing world with the sexual tension between them. It's really quite amazing. Isn't it? But but is Germaine Greer, does she fall into a problem of, she was hot, like she had a moment, and then do you think like, has her thought is she not on a hot streak anymore? And it's kind of amazing because she helped define, certainly in England, second wave feminism, and now she seems to be hated by most feminists. I mean, how does she fit into your genius, man?
True in Britain. where
Okay.
she lived most of her life. I mean, she's originally Australian. I think because of the transgender revolt of the last 10 years, she became very unfashionable with the people who came of age at that time, right? Because she was seen as being insufficiently inclusive of transgender women. But I think as in Britain, the scales have tipped back towards whatever you want to call it, sex realism, gender critical feminism. People are now also rediscovering their love of Germaine Greer's brutal, radical honesty, I think
Right.
we might call
Yeah.
it. And personally, my favorite Germaine is not why I think naked boys are attractive Germaine. That was a strange Germaine, nor even the Germaine of the whole woman or the female eunuch, but her writing on art criticism. She wrote a book about female painters called The Obstacle Race, which I read when I was revising this. As a scholar, I think she's got another one that's called something like Kissing the Rod, which is about restoration poetry. It's a very Germaine Greer title. But, she was an exceptional close reader of text and of paintings. And I wonder, actually, when the kind of outrage about her comparing trans women to spaniels has all died down, we will remember the quality of her thought in the same way that I think people now appreciate. You mentioned Valerie Solanas, but I'm thinking more of Andrea Dworkin. There's been a Penguin has just reissued all of Andrea Dworkin's works because it's now been long enough that people have kind of got over themselves about her controversies and remembered the interesting contributions that she'd made. But this kind of comes exactly to what the whole of the book is about, which is all of that depends on a generation of women my age or below who want to remember her, who want to keep enshrining her. This idea of history as a process. We want to keep her memory and what she wrote alive. And that's ultimately where the historical judgment comes from. It's whether or not the next generation think you're important.
It seems to me that Britain has more, and I use this term with air quotes, TERFs than American feminism. And it's, I
think America maybe has a lot of if you want to define it like this, 80% of America just thinks that sex matters and that there is difference between trans women and women, right? It's just that, that those are
and
opinions.
None of that implies
right wing.
Yeah, none of that implies, a different legal standing and anything like that. But I guess it, I have struggled, there's a tradition of French feminism, which is its own thing, and then Anglo-American feminism. And I found it interesting, I guess, in a way that there are very few American feminists who are of a Germaine Greer level, who exist and are talking publicly about that. And I just wonder if you have a quick gloss on why it seemed that second wave feminism seem to, and I mean that I realize these terms are imprecise, but it kind of stuck around longer, it seems like, in England than it did in America.
I mean, I think it's probably because of the trade union movement and the left feminist movement, whereas I think that America things became much more polarized, and that the kind of, and also I think that America, because abortion dominated the conversation for so long and continues to dominate it, that everybody gets sucked into that. And there isn't a lot of space for other stuff, plus stuff like, employment law being so much more federal in America, that actually what are the kind of big, and again in America, race having been such a big part of the conversation for so much longer. I mean, Britain is now a much more diverse country than it was, but in the 90s, it was still 95% white. So, these are just much more recent kind of questions about whether or not feminism is quote unquote white. That wasn't in 1920, that was not a question in British feminism because everybody was white, whereas it was a huge deal in America. And so I think that, all of those social factors, I think might account for it.
I was just thinking as you were talking about England being blessedly white, even into the 1990s.
Whoa! I didn't say that, but yes,
I was going to say if you're looking for supplementary material for the eventual paperback edition of this, it would be great to look at Eric Clapton as a genius, who then went on to a bit of racial,
a very Shockley trajectory. It's like, so did you love Layla, but would you also like to hear my thoughts on race? No, just play Layla again. That was great. That was really great. Thank you, Eric. No. Yeah.
And he also has a few thoughts on COVID.
I'm sure John Lennon would have had a few thoughts on COVID. I'm just saying.
This is where I think John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, is kind of, he's a very stable genius, because whatever is dominant thinking, he will be on the other side of it at any
Yeah.
given moment in time. But let's talk about Musk quickly. Musk is kind of, he's not the controlling metaphor of your book, but he is, he is the controlling genius, right, of our moment. And do you think is his recent foray into politics, does that tarnish him? Because I was thinking, there's a science writer based in Canada named Dan Gardner, has a fabulous Substack called Past, Present, Future or something like that. And he wrote a lot about Henry Ford, and he was like, hey, I want to tell you a story about a car maker who really kind of blew his reputation by talking about stuff he didn't really know anything about. And it's about Henry Ford, who was a great genius at mass production and all of this kind of stuff. And then he got bored running a car company and he's like, okay, I'm going to solve World War One.
And didn't he become a massive anti-Semite?
Oh, he was, he is the, the Bob Dylan of anti-Semites or so. I don't know who's the ultimate
He went electric.
Jew.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
okay.
but yes, absolutely. And then he also ended up, suing people who libeled him for describing him accurately and then losing status in public court hearings, because he's an idiot about all of this kind of stuff. Do you think Elon Musk is, where does that story go? Because he's the epitome of galaxy brain. And it's like, he's good at these things. So every thought he has is good. And we have to put up with him. He's working for people who, he was working for an administration where people want to have more kids and be Christian. And he's like, we don't know how many children he has. Virtually none of them in a marriage setting or, now he's divorced, but increasingly it's not even clear, how many there are and under what circumstances they were born. That's one thing that people tolerate because he's good at making money and making cars. But then this political foray where he's going back to Texas, is that the type of thing that like destroys his genius myth? Or does it remain to be seen?
I mean, I think it does. And, how I've always felt about it is the SpaceX, which is the truly innovative business, if it manages to make reusable rockets work in that way that it drives down the cost of space travel, that allows us to become a, interplanetary species, I would have thought in 400 years' time, we're not going to, be talking about his bad tweets. But at current rate, I think he deeply risks falling into that Shockley pattern of somebody whose juice kind of runs out. Because, look at the Doge, as we're talking, he's just been giving us a round of kind of exit interviews, complaining it was a lot harder than he thought it would have been. And do you know how he could have found out how hard it would have been? He could have asked me, an idiot, to tell him that it's not the fact that governments are harder to run than private businesses because you can't have creative destruction. You can't just let a government fail and someone else will move in. People die and don't get the social security checks. Like, these are important things. But instead, he trampled through that undergrowth like a kind of huge rhino, insistent that he knew best. And shock horror, if he'd gone into that with his undoubted skills but had learned more first, he would have been more successful at it.
Well, it's from a kind of reason angle. It was frustrating because there are people who work at reason, but also there's a whole archipelago of gulag archipelago of think tanks of people who have said this is how you cut government spending and waste, et cetera. And like there are almost, off-the-shelf plans you can bring in as opposed to going in and then, not succeeding.
And ones that are increasingly picking up traction on the left, right? If you look at the whole abundance agenda, a lot of that is really saying like places like California don't work because they over-regulate and they try and, what's that phrase of Ezra Klein's, everything bagel liberalism. They go, why don't we make this housing project also solve racism and wild birds and also this kind of stuff? So there's definitely a libertarian critique that is, people do feel that government is slow and sclerotic, and a more humble man might have read those things first.
The point with Musk is that, like, and I guess this is part of where geniuses go to kind of destroy themselves. They really don't think that, they, as your book argues, and I think it's completely persuasive, that the breakthrough technologies are never the result of one person, but then when you get exalted like that, then you stop looking around for the expertise or the team that will actually help you produce results. Then you're looking for yes men or people who your circle becomes, you become Kanye West or something, where nobody around you is going to say no.
Yeah, and I think the really interesting examples of that. So Picasso and Einstein are probably our most obvious examples. Most people's go-to idea of an artistic and scientific genius. But Einstein never really accepts quantum mechanics. And so when he dies, he's more a celebrity than he is the kind of person in the field that the young physicists look to. And then Picasso similarly doesn't go to pure abstraction. He doesn't end up in the place of Rothko. And that's because they had their paradigm shift. They had their moment where they were the perfect brain to meet the moment. And I think you probably see something very similar with Musk. He had a playbook, which if you read Character Limit, the book about his takeover from Twitter, he brings in his lieutenants, they lock everybody out of the systems, they just fire everybody and then rehire the people that they need. Like he just had this way that he had thought had worked for him in the past. And he went, well, why can't I bring on big balls? I'm going to do that to the government too. And he just didn't realize that it was not the same environment, and that his one thing that had worked from him before would now not serve him anymore. And that to me exactly was what you're saying. It's a classic genius myth that you think I've got the answer, not realizing that different questions have different answers.
Right. And to go back to that idea of domain-specific intelligence or expertise, that not everything is like everything else. I mean, that was one of the great myths in American capitalism in the mid-century. That was destroyed. The idea that all businesses, regardless of what you actually produce, they can all be managed by a set of professional managers who are trained in management. And it's like, no, it turns out that shipbuilding is very different than oil production, and that's different than newspapers and all of that. If I may, are there good examples of geniuses who face they run into the wall that Musk has drove his own Tesla into with Doge and everything, who then kind of come back? What are there characters who are there? Paul McCartney's whose second or the last 2/3 of his career are actually as good or as interesting as the first third?
That's a really good question. And I will probably have to give it more thought than I'm able to on the hoof, because I'll tell you what, I can't think of any examples offhand, but as you're saying that, I can see what a great story that is, right? And how much people would love that story. So there probably are examples of it. I'm thinking of the example of that kid who was the actor who was in Indiana Jones, who then didn't really do anything for ages and then won the Oscar for Everything Everywhere All at Once, right? People love that idea that this was the ultimate comeback story. And so I can totally see that there was a situation like that where somebody had been piddling away for a while and then they came back with something. But I don't know. I mean, the best versions, I think, of people are your McCartneys or your Springsteens, or, I went to see the Pixies last week, and people who just carry on doing something because they clearly love it. The fans love it. They enjoy it. And the Pixies gig was very interesting because clearly people were there to hear the songs primarily from Surfer Rose, their 1990s album. But they play those quite happily. And then they play some of their new stuff too. And I just thought this is quite a good acknowledgement of this was the moment that we were hottest. And we're not in that moment too. But also we don't hate those people or resent that we love that it happened. We're not sad that it doesn't go on forever.
Fascinating. Yeah, I started my career as a teen magazine and rock music journalist. And there's nothing worse than, bands or artists who hate the work that made them famous. It's an awful life.
Sad, isn't it? It's really sad.
It is. And, and there are people, I think, I'm thinking of somebody like Nick Cave or Bob Dylan, where, and I mean, they're very different, but Dylan refused to go away, and he goes through cycles of where stuff starts to make sense, even if it seems horrible at the first time. And Cave has certainly been growing as an artist. And, somebody like Madonna obviously didn't. I think she stopped in a way that is, but had a fantastic run. Can I just real quickly do a little bit of biology, a little bit of biology on you, a little bit of biography, because you mentioned at one point, and this I thought was fascinating in the book, that your father in the 50s took one of these inscrutable to Americans,
11
level, test level, whatever, 13th grade. I read ton of Beatles biographies, and they're always talking about I ruined by A level. Blah. I have no idea what they're talking about.
It's
And
not
like,
easy to understand, like
yeah,
SATs. Yeah.
yeah, no, of course, which is its own kind of bullshit. But you know, your father did well on a test, and that meant that he got to go to university. And like, can you know, what is your background? And you know, how did you get to be where you're at?
So the test you're talking about is the 11 plus, which kids took at the age of 11, and that at the time, this is after. So my parents were both born in 1945, so this is in the aftermath of the Second World War. The idea was if you came from a working class family, and every other kind of family, but that this was that they were going to try and make it a higher level of education more accessible to a greater number of people. But the way to do that was by selecting by ability. So you took this test at 11, and if you passed it, you went to a grammar school. If you didn't, you went to what was called a secondary modern or a technical school. And the idea was that, you know, you either had an academic education or you had one that was more vocational and based around going to trades. Unfortunately, and
Because
there are
at 11, come on, the bed, the bread is baked, right?
well, that is a big. I mean, we mentioned Lewis Terman a long time ago, and you know, and he also at that time, well, he's a bit earlier than that, thought that you could kind of pick winners, future winners, very early, and that's not always possible. And the other thing that it did was create a. You know, you will hear people today who will say the 11 plus was amazing because I got chances I wouldn't have otherwise got. But that's a kind of survivorship bias because you don't hear as much from the people whose lives were ruined by the fact that they were told at 11 they were not good enough. But in his case, it meant that he was the first in his family to go to university. He went to Aston University in Birmingham and studied chemistry. He worked for first of all, for Worcester Porcelain, where I grew up. It has its own delightful porcelain. And then for a place that made things that you melt steel in, crucibles. Sorry, no, you're loving how much of an English stereotype I am, aren't you?
Yeah,
so the
this
delightful
is
bone china. Yeah, from the potteries. But you know, he benefited definitely from that. You know, that he got lifted up like that. And on my mum's side, my granddad, who was Scottish, was he was a coal miner. And he moved south and took civil service exams as an adult. And then, so he was the engine of, like, he moved from the working class to middle class at that point. And mum then went to the same school that I ended up going to, which was a convent school, a Catholic school. So, you know, I came from a really nice, normal, middle class household, but this was in the Midlands in England. I didn't know anybody who was a journalist. I didn't know anybody who lived in London. Even like Birmingham was quite exciting to me. So, I do have to kind of remind myself every so often that if I could go back and talk to 16-year-old me about what I do and who I know, she would be pretty impressed.
Yeah. It is kind of fascinating, isn't it? And there's a version of this in the US and I think throughout the West and even much of the developing world where tests, you can look at kind of tests, whether they're IQ tests or, aptitude tests. And they're used in many ways to reinforce the status quo or to naturalize it. But then oftentimes the goal, even when they were implemented, was not necessarily to do that, but it was actually to be more egalitarian and be more meritocratic, which, like intelligence, needs to be contextualized and things like that. To me, I find that
it's not necessarily a bad impulse, is it? Because actually,
right.
the signature event in my academic career was I went to Oxford University, and that is determined.
Well, Oxford, is that a vocational school?
In the Cotswolds. But that wasn't determined by tests for English. That was determined by interview. And you know what? That obviously privileges eloquent bullshitters. I mean, the die was cast in my future in podcasting because that's exactly what that selects for. And so all the things, tests are bad in some ways, but they're also sort of, they're the worst thing apart from all the other things, right? We haven't yet invented a way of designing education that weeds out bias. And, like the 11 plus was notoriously problematic because it was easier for middle class kids to pass it because they had more knowledge, and often just flat out their parents hired tutors to take them through it. Now what happens is that there are a very few grammar schools left, and the house prices around them are exceptionally high.
Right. Yeah.
So you end up with a class sorting by who can afford to buy a house in that area.
That's to talk about the abundance agenda. And, I always think when I hear about Ezra Klein, I'm like, if you want to read what Ezra Klein is going to write tomorrow, read what Reason was publishing 20 years ago. But part of it is when it comes to things like educational opportunity and whatnot, the idea that, well, there are only 10 universities. So we have to make it a tighter and tighter filter to get the right people into that. It's like maybe you create a world where there are many, many different universities, or there's more schooling opportunities rather than funneling people through. In America, there was, it's starting to retreat, and not necessarily for good reasons, but there was this birth of gifted and talented programs. And most of the time, it wasn't just like, well, if you hit this level of testing, you'll be in the gifted and talented program. It's like, well, we only have a certain number of slots. And well, it's like, but if the test says you're gifted and talented, why don't you expand the program? But oftentimes the function of schooling is not to increase opportunity, but to maintain the existing power structure. That's my...
No, I know. And there's loads of stuff that happens like that. Like the Ivy Leagues, which excluded or limited Jewish students in the first half of the 20th century. They did that through, they saying, we want to look at well-rounded students, or they moved their recruitment pools out of New York City and into the outer boroughs or whatever it might be. I think, I think
that's the only way. I think that T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound got into Ivy League schools because they were from Missouri and Idaho. So they benefited from the geographical quotas. Yeah.
But this is the thing that I think is one of the big themes of the book, is like a level of humility about the system that we have and whether or not it is, free from bias, and whether things that look natural and inevitable to us are actually the result of things that we can't see. Because there are a lot of invisible hands. And actually sometimes extremely visible hands if you care to look for them.
Yeah, the Ivy Leagues now have a different way of keeping Jews off the campus, right? So they,
but this is what I mean. It's like, this is not the first time that America has had debates about affirmative action. It just used to be the affirmative action was in favor of WASPs in the 1920s. That's
right. Yes, and I'm glad to live in a post-WASP America for the most part. Just a final question about your method. Have you ever been called a genius, or or is
Why?
And one of the things that I find remarkable in your work, both the podcasting and other things, but then your writing work, is that what you do, and I always take this as a sign of an excellent journalist, and I don't really care about geniuses, but like that you find a topic and then you report out on it, and it's like that way you don't have to worry about a hot streak or a cold streak, because what you're doing, like, the onus isn't on you to be a genius all the time or come up with new and novel things to say, but you can, you go out into the world and see what's happening. I mean, it seems to me that it's a rare model for journalism, but it seems to be obviously the best way to do it.
It's a great relief just to be like, I am not actually that interesting. What I do is I go and put myself in interesting places and meet interesting people, and I will tell you about them. And like you say, I'm surprised more people don't do it, because it's a huge burden off you if you're not trying to be the main character in your drama. If you're instead content to be the amanuensis at the side, then it's a huge, it's a weight off your shoulders to be. And I think again, this is what drives a lot of modern journalists kind of mad, is if you're only telling a story at which you're the protagonist, you need to keep doing stuff. And actually just go and talk to other people. Other people are mad. They say crazy things. Yeah.
That's Tom Wolfe in the introduction to his collection, The New Journalism, which was about stuff from the 60s and early 70s, published in the early 70s. So that's what, he said that it was like, it was amazing. Like, so many weird things were happening in America, and all you had to do was go out and hang out with the people. And he's seen as somebody who is a genius, and he has genius insights and a stylist, but he himself, he says in plain sight, like, just, go and talk to people who are doing things you think are interesting, and like, you are interesting. But
it's also just the most fun. I mean, there's nothing that makes me happier than being in some random bit of backstreet America, just talking to people whose life experiences are completely different to mine. And I wish that more people got the opportunity to do it, to be honest.
The color that you add to talking about going to or witnessing one of the SpaceX launches or recoveries is brilliant, because it's out in the world. It's wonderful. I have kept you over long. I apologize for that. Where are the best places that people should look for your work?
You can find most of it through my Substack, which is helenlewis.substack.com. And also my longer, more considered work is at The Atlantic, who are very kind in giving me, the thing that I really like about working for them is that they invest in you as a person. And like you say, reporting is the best and most fun thing to do. And it's not the easiest thing to do in journalism at the moment. So I give them huge credit for letting me be my best self. God, that's so therapy speak, isn't it? I'm sorry, what a hateful note to end on. I'm going to go and have like a muffin and a crumpet and be overly British.
Yeah, maybe talk about Princess Diana and how sad it's is that. Are you up on the royals? Do you like the royal family?
I know. There was a time when I really the Prince Harry saga where I was threatening to become the kind of Atlantic's royal correspondent just because I enjoy writing about them, and by God, do Americans love reading about them.
I don't understand that, and I think Harry was best when he was following in, was it Edward the 7th or 8th, when he was doing the Nazi costumes?
I was going to say being a Nazi. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. It's all been downhill for him since then. Helen Lewis, thank you so much. It was a real delight talking to you. And The Genius Myth is, it's a spectacular book. It's the best thing you've written recently until the next one. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.